Greetings, Ed Psych students. Here we are trying to make up for missed class. I appreciate your patience on this. Remember that if you're a student in my particular section of the course, that I'm going to want to see copies of the notes that you take for this. So take notes just like you would in class. If you have questions about anything, I'll be more than happy to deal with those questions when I get back next week. What we want to do today in these few minutes is to go over Piaget's last two stages, concrete operations and formal operations. You've seen this before. This shows you all four of Piaget's stages of cognitive development. And if you remember, the name of the stage tells you how the brain is getting its information and how the brain is learning about things. So in the first stage, between birth and 2 years of age, the sensory motor stage, Piaget said that most of the information that the kid gets is coming in from his sensory activities, from his sensations, and from his motor activities. A child that is 2 to 7 years old in the pre-operational stage is beginning to think. He has the ability to make mental representations of words and images. He's starting to get a well-developed vocabulary, but there's no logic present. They still use a lot of magical thinking. Now, about the time a child gets to be 7 years old, between 7 and about 11 or 12 years old, kids begin to move in the direction of concrete operational thought, and then finally at age 12 and above, into formal operational thinking. For Piaget, an operation is logical thinking. So that might be something for you to write down, that operational thinking is logical thinking. And so kids that are in concrete operations use concrete logic, and kids that are in formal operations use formal logic. Okay? Concrete logic is where we're going to start. Notice that this says ages 7 to 11. You're going to find a variety of ages depending on the source that you look at. I was originally taught, and I think that you'll find a broader range of sources that give you ages 6 to 12. Okay, so basically first grade through sixth grade. And in the concrete operational stage, kids begin to use logical reasoning instead of their intuitive and magical thinking, but they only do it in concrete situations. In other words, very discrete, where they've got objects that they can look at, things that they can feel. By this time, they're also starting to develop conservation, which you saw an example in class of a little girl that did not have conservation. So in other words, they recognize that some of the characteristics of an object stay the same even though the object might change in appearance. Kids at this age are also beginning to lose a lot of their centration. If you remember centration, that was the characteristic that they have of only being able to focus on one characteristic at a time. And because they're losing centration, they can now begin to classify things, they can begin to put things in order, and they can begin to use that kind of complex logic that's on the bottom of the screen. If A is greater than B and B is greater than C, then A is greater than C. Those kind of statements will begin to make sense to a kid during the time that he's between ages 7 and 11. Other things that happen when kids begin to think in a more organized and logical fashion is that they do gain conservation fully by the time they get to be about 12 years old. When we talk about class inclusion, that's simply a way of saying that a kid can make classifications of things. And so collecting becomes kind of an interest for them. Kids like to collect baseball cards or butterflies because they can start breaking them up into all kinds of different groups. Seriation becomes possible. Seriation is simply putting things in order. And then they also have more effective spatial reasoning. If you look closely at the little cartoon that's presented there, that's typically the kind of cartoon that shows the kind of task that these kids are just now beginning to be able to handle. In other words, considering more than one characteristic at a time, putting two things in order. And if I dare try to explain the humor in the cartoon, these kids are also wonderfully logical. So down at the bottom, the joke is that the kid winds up asking himself, does he need a goat anyway? All right. It's one of the characteristics of kids in this age. Now, when you're dealing with concrete operational thought, there are going to be some things that you can't do. And so concrete operations in mathematics work well, but the kids are going to have problems with abstract ideas. The difference between concrete and abstract will become more apparent to you when you get out and start teaching. But you can see that saying that x is equal to 3 in an algebraic equation is going to be pretty abstract. Likewise, fractions can be pretty abstract for little kids. But when teachers begin to use math manipulatives, and you can show that I've got 4 here and I take 1 out of a total of 4, I have 1 over 4, I've got 1/4, then that kind of concrete demonstration where a kid has something sitting on the table in front of them becomes more possible. Now, there's also, your text makes a note of this characteristic continuum of acquisition. What this means is that not everybody develops the same characteristics at the same time. They don't necessarily all develop them in the same order. And so it progresses from a small amount to a larger amount of completion of these concrete operational tasks over time, over the whole 6 years that they're in the phase. Once kids get to be about 12 years old, or about the time they get into puberty, they enter formal operational thinking, and that's, like it says, about 12 years old or older. When a kid gets into formal operational thinking, they can begin to think in abstract, idealistic, and logical ways. In other words, they can conceive of the world in ways that you can't see, okay? They begin to be able to use hypothetical deductive reasoning, okay? They can make up possible solutions, more than one solution, to potential problems, and then they can think about the solutions that they haven't tried yet and think about why they would work or why they would not work. You can see that you're holding a lot of information in your brain and you're playing around with ideas in your brain, and that's the whole notion of hypothetical deductive formal operational thinking. There's also a characteristic known as adolescent egocentrism, and partly because of puberty, partly because of the way that their brains are working, there are two characteristics that come up. The first is identified as the personal fable, and the second is identified as the imaginary audience. And if you think about kids that are in middle school, early middle school, so ages 11, 12, 13, okay, one of the things that characterizes them is the limited thinking that they have that causes them to engage in what's known as this personal fable. The personal fable is where you believe that your life is completely unique and no one has ever lived the life that you have before. It makes it difficult for you to learn from the experience of others, and it gives you a very strong emotional attachment to a lot of things. And so, for example, a kid that's having his first crush on his science teacher might think that no one has ever loved someone like this, like they have. Romeo and Juliet had nothing over this 6th grader and his science teacher because, oh my gosh, she's just the most beautiful person in the world. And when mom or dad says, oh, get over it, these things happen, then the kid doesn't believe him because he's engaging in a personal fable. No one has ever lived my life before. Likewise, kids have what's known as the imaginary audience, and the imaginary audience is when they're acting like they have a spotlight trained on them. They suddenly become aware that they have characteristics that other people can see. And all of a sudden, because they can see their characteristics and it's important to them, they think that it's important to everyone else. And so when you have a kid in middle school and he's going to go to a dance and he has to pick every item of clothing with great care because everybody in the world is going to be watching him come into the dance. We all know that that's not true, but to him, he thinks it's true. It's his imaginary audience. Formal operations also involve things like propositional thought. We've talked about that a little bit, the verbal logic, the fact that you can propose verbal solutions to problems and evaluate them without actually having to do things. And then hypothetical deductive reasoning, where you can come up with hypotheses, things that might work just by reading a theory. Now, as young kids, 12, 13 years old, begin to have all of these changes in their brain, they begin to realize that the world doesn't necessarily look the same way to everybody else as it does to them. They begin to recognize that other people have points of view. And so one of the things that can do is that can tend to make them somewhat self-conscious. They can be very, very sensitive to criticism. And part of that is a result of the imaginary audience and the personal fable. They don't understand their importance in the world. They think they're it. And they think that they are living a completely unique life. Tends to make them very self-conscious. The other thing is that they tend to be excessively ideal. They're using logic to figure out how the world works, and there's no good reason, for example, when we know that a police officer has to take an oath, there's no good reason for that cop to go back on his oath and to be a crook. And so they tend to have kind of an excessively idealistic view of the world, and they're also then very critical of the things that they see that don't seem to match up to the standards that they think they should have. They also have a lack in their decision-making skills. Like it says, they tend to overvalue their own experience, and they haven't had a whole lot of experience. And so consequently, the 16-year-old who gets his driver's license really does think that because he's driven a car for 30 hours with somebody else in the car with him, that driving is now easy, and to drive at 100 miles an hour is something that he should be able to do quite easily, even though he doesn't understand it, and you wouldn't be able to tell him the difference. A lot of times, too, because their thinking has to be somewhat intentional, they can be very, very overwhelmed by the options and not really know how to process decision-making. Now, Piaget has got a pretty solid theory, and it's the theory that is probably the dominant theory of cognitive development in schools today. But there are some significant criticisms of his work. First off, people tend to think that he's off on children's competence. Piaget was pretty rigid in his schedule that you're going to be able to do this by the time you're age 12, you're going to be able to do this by the time you're age 6. And when we start experimentally looking at those milestones, we find out that some of them come much earlier and some of them come much later, which relates to his stages. He was very rigid in his stages, and as you'll see in the last slide for this section, the way his stages actually work out are not near as rigid as he thinks they should be. We can also train children to use logic at a higher level than they should be able to, because their brains will allow them to accept that. He thought that the training was not going to last unless kids were ready to move into this next phase, and we found out that that's not necessarily true. Okay? The other thing that Piaget doesn't address is he doesn't address anything about the influence of culture on education. It's all cognitive, it's all inputs and outputs, and he pretty much looked at it as being the same for everybody. And we know now from studying a variety of different cultures that kids learn differently in different cultures because of language and history. We'll get into more of that when we talk about Vygotsky's theory. Finally, the last slide that I've got to show you, if you take time to look at this slide in detail, you can see that it's showing you the gradual transition that your students will make as they move from one stage to the other. If you look closely at this slide, when kids are 5 years old, it's showing that most of them are in pre-operational thought, but already at age 5, there are some kids that are moving in to concrete operations. That's the red bar at the top. Now, if you jump all the way up to age 12, you can see that at age 12, you're still going to have a minority of students who are in pre-operational thinking. You're going to have some that are in the onset of concrete thinking, some in mature concrete thinking, and others that are even going to be moving ahead into formal operations, the green box at the top. And so you can see that it's one of the reasons why teaching middle school is such a challenge, because when you look at where kids are at from basically age 10 to 14, you can see that they have a huge variety of thinking styles. The slide on the right gives you an estimate of the attainment of formal operations by high school students. And you can see that when kids are in 9th grade, there's only about 20% of them that have fully attained formal operations. And even when they get into 12th grade, there's still only about a third of them who have fully attained formal operations. That, by the way, is a criticism of Piaget's theory that I forgot to mention. Piaget couldn't explain why probably half the people never really get into fully formed operational thinking, even as adults, according to his definition. All right, I think that's about all I want to do with this. Make sure you send me a picture of your notes. If you have any questions, we'll meet in class on Monday. Thanks a lot.